Okay, for people joining our live stream here, our third live streamed meeting of the day, we are continuing our discussion about how to represent annotations in Wolfram Language. And Carlo, you have this. This is the functions that exist for graphs with properties. Is that correct?
Correct. And the other one are, most of them are implemented for audio annotations, and some of them have been discussed like the annotated wrapper.
Okay, but this here, set property, is what we were discussing as annotate, correct?
Yes, yes. I'm not sure a conclusion has been reached on what is the proper name, but yes. In audio implementation, it is called audio annotate.
Okay, all right. Just a minute, I just want to record this. Okay. All right, so now what are we looking at here? So this is vertex labels. Is it, Charles, is this is what it does right now, is that correct?
That is the current behavior of the graphs, yes.
Correct.
Okay. And so this would become, instead of saying property value, this would now become annotation value.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. So this is now example data. We would say annotate that. So this would just be annotate, correct?
Mm-hmm.
It might be still safer to just go with object annotate specific ones and then later on merge them if possible. I don't know how universal we want to make it at the get-go.
Well, what other specific annotates are there?
So at the moment we have audio annotate, and I'm not sure if image annotate is already existing, but that was the plan.
But
I think we need better use cases before we roll out image annotations. Really, we need to use it ourselves. It's too early. If we roll it out, it's going to be wrong. We're going to have to fix it.
Reasonable.
Inconvenience everybody. But I think it can go for 12.1, you know, as long as we focus on building up good use cases.
But Stephen, were you interested in other instances of object annotate, or what kinds of things?
The mesh, the things that's been there for a while. The mesh works exactly like graph.
Okay.
You know, so boundary mesh region, they support the same level of properties / annotations as graph does.
And I don't see any special value to have a, annotate or graph annotate. Right, because the second argument is roughly the same, right? Tag, where, and what. So,
the additional value that we have in audio for audio annotate is that we can compute automatically annotations from the content of the signal.
I see.
I see.
So in other words, you would say with graph. Okay, so Charles, the analog of that would be, for example, for a graph layout, you could explicitly spray coordinates for the embedding into the graph. Am I making sense?
Right, yes.
But so what happens right now, which I don't think you have the functionality for, is what we would say then is something like, I mean, I don't know, annotate a graph, comma, vertex coordinates, let's say. Okay, and that would mean, if we did it that way, that would mean go and try and automatically figure out what those vertex coordinates are and insert those annotations into the graph.
So that's done anyways.
Right. Anyways, we just delete and do that at the right time for efficiency, but do that anyway.
Okay, fine. But let's imagine that I wanted to spray those annotations into the graph because I'm going to process them in some way, for example. Or maybe it's a different annotation which is not auto-compute.
I think something, so the standard properties or standard annotations, which there's quite a few for graph and mesh, you have to do with styles and labels, shapes, or coordinates.
Yeah. Okay. Fine. But I mean, I'm saying what Carlo is saying is that audio annotate.
No, I get it. I know.
You can say audio, comma speakers, for example, and it will automatically annotate speakers everywhere.
Right. But more commonly, I kind of think that we will have functions that do that rather than we don't, because it's a significant thing to identify speakers. It's not an insignificant thing.
Yeah. Right.
You know, and
well, so you're saying that it won't necessarily be the word annotate.
I think it might be something else. And what it does, it takes your audio and produces annotated audio out with speakers annotated. And we might be a more richer way to return values. And that gives us kind of better workflows.
Okay, well, so the next question would be, is annotate the right name for the general thing? The only thing I don't like here particularly, go ahead, what are people going to say?
Well, obviously, personally for graph, it doesn't seem to match that well, annotate to annotation. Because for some property like weight, capacity, and such, it's not per se annotation.
Yeah, I know, but this property isn't right either. So what do we want that is, okay, so is there something we can come up with that is neither annotation nor property?
Attribute would have been perfect.
Okay, well, let's write down some of these words. Attribute, which we can't use. It's not meta information. It's there are words like gloss, which nobody will understand.
Did you say gloss?
Gloss, yes.
No, I don't understand that.
Well, it's not worth understanding. I mean, there's like the footnote type thing.
Something based on mark.
On what?
Mark.
Yeah, that's actually another thing that's used in some areas, disjoint areas. So for instance, point processes, when you want to have additional properties on points, they're called marks. And in PDE solving, when you want to mark you mark your different boundary conditions differently because different things are going to apply to them. They're also called marks. So mark is another.
What about extra? I mean, see, the problem is it wants to be something generic. It's not really a property in the case of something like this audio annotation. It's hardly, it's not, it's something that kind of floats above the actual thing itself.
I mean, the problem is that the word that you want depends on how high above you're floating.
Exactly what I was going to say. I think that there's a whole span of it. Okay, so the things that Charles brought up with weight, like a weighted graph, feels very fundamental. We unified it, so we have a single object that deals with multi-graphs, weighted graphs, all kinds of things.
Let's write down some of these things. Okay, types of quotes annotation. Okay, so weights in a graph. Colors of vertices.
Okay,
then
so
we have, very differently, we have things like who is speaking. Here, what animal is this region in the picture? Okay, so Okay, what are some other examples? Where a vertex is placed. What are some other?
There are plenty more examples for graphs. So capacity. So there's weights. There's capacities.
Yeah. Okay. I'm looking for ones that are more, add-ons. If you understand what I'm saying. I understand there are ones that are quite fundamental. There are also ones that are add-ons. And for meshes, can we describe that also for meshes?
So for meshes, it's a little simpler. Most of the properties there have to do with styles and labels.
Okay.
And there's plenty.
Well, I mean, there's also the marker, right? Like you pointed out earlier.
Well, the mark is.
What is the mark?
So that gives you basically kind of like a color or a label in the sense of like 1, 2, 3 that tells you this collection of boundary regions, or boundary elements, going to have the following constraint on it. That's how it's used operationally.
This collection. Why is it called a mark?
That's the tradition there. Okay, so it's a way to give tags, if you like, to subsets of boundary regions, of boundary. Yeah.
Okay, so there's basically tagging is another type of thing. Tagging, e.g., to associate related pieces of a mesh or something.
Right.
But I'm guessing you're also after things like high curvature, low curvature regions of a mesh, right? That is really something that needs computations.
We don't, no, but you could imagine that. But no, it's not.
Okay, all right. So what about in a notebook? Do we think we're going to have these things in notebooks as well? And what would these be in, I mean, for things that have an appearance in a notebook, we're using style. Am I making sense? So the precedents are things like style. We've got things like labeled, which might turn into one of these kinds of annotations. Is that true or is that not true? Like, for example, in a graph, can you use labeled?
Yes.
And what does it do? Does it turn into something that is vertex labels,
Yes.
goes to whatever?
Yes.
Okay.
If you open the page for documentation of graph, there is a list of them, about 7, like tooltip, annotation, labels.
These things here.
Yes.
So provide an annotation is this other weird version of annotation, right?
Yes.
Okay, so now what do these become? Do these become something else or do they stay as they are?
Different. So if we go down the list, we can work our way.
This is a bug in the version 12 thing that these don't paste at the right size. Did that get reported? Who is PMing here?
I'm Stephen. I'm taking a screenshot. I did not know, but I will report it now.
Was it the wrong size, or did it just scroll when it pasted?
No, it was the wrong size. It was the size. It was the source size rather than resizing for the destination notebook.
Okay.
I've seen this multiple times before. I've reported it at least twice.
So, Stephen, if you go down that list,
yeah,
button, event handler, hyperlink, pop-up window, status area, and tooltip effectively go out as wrappers in the resulting graphics rendering of it.
Okay, so there's processing basically that's done.
Yes. Style, labeled, go into more fundamental places.
Okay, all right. So they burrow into the actual data structure.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, annotation just sits there as a, go out in the resulting rendering graphics. So it just sits there.
Okay. So, and is there is there an LValue nonsense going on here or not?
Yes, and that's crucial. Or do you want to design slow things as usual?
No, I don't. But that semantics is just not. It just doesn't make sense. It just
so one day we need a long psychological session with you and discuss your phobia about L values.
Yeah, it's because they're a mess. Because they involve having. I mean, how do you do it? You say property of graph, comma something.
Property value.
Of what? Of A being a graph?
Yeah.
A indirectly references a graph. So if A is equal to B is equal to C is equal to a graph, what happens?
What?
If A equals B equals C equals a graph, what happens?
This being an L value is no different from list L values. There's no.
But what happens in this case?
Then in this case, is the reference is on A, so only A change, not B or C.
Okay.
So we preserve the immutability.
Okay. All right. So all right.
So in our notation here, there would be property value or annotation value A, comma where equals val.
Okay, and you're proposing that works for audio as well.
I think that would be good, yeah.
It was our first implementation, then we changed it to not have that. But
the critical thing that we got for graphs and other things is that allows us to get real-time, for instance, algorithm animations and things.
Yeah.
And they're big objects, so one thing you learn with big objects, don't.
So wait a minute. So the algorithm animation works by having dynamic on the A.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, that's reasonable enough.
And it's really slick and very cool.
Okay. All right. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So let's keep going discussing what this should be called. So we need a neutral name that is not. I agree that annotation seems too floating above. Properties seems too much inside the thing. So how do we make it neutral with respect to that? Tagging seems too. What's that?
Characteristics. That's too long, but also a little low. Maybe.
Well, let's see. It's way too complicated.
Yeah.
Trait.
Very biological.
Or very computer sciencey.
What does it mean in computer science?
Type systems. What does it mean?
It generally represents a class of interfaces or behaviors that can be attached to a type.
Okay. I think it's way too elaborate.
Tag.
We've got too many things called tag already. And tag suggests it doesn't do anything.
Under traits, it says characteristic, attribute, feature, quality, property. Those are the.
I was going to say we don't have feature on our list.
Those are the synonyms, but it's funny that we hit them, just about all of them.
Yes.
Feature.
Right, but we do have a set of functions around feature too.
True.
Yes. Okay. See, what I like for example, a name like association has worked very well for us. It's nice and neutral and it describes what it is. What is this thing? Don't say it associates stuff with things. But what is this thing really?
So what we're making is the object that is annotated becomes richer and has more information about itself inside itself.
Maybe
Yes.
details?
That's what I was just going to say, details.
Or local metadata.
So then you're going to be detailing something when you add it?
That's obviously ridiculous.
No.
I mean, it is what detailing means typically. You know, it's. I admit that it has a weird card kind of. Okay, let's see how these other words would work here. Okay, so see, unfortunately, this would be details. By the way, we've got a bunch of background noise. Could we cut it out? It'd be good. How would it work for this? Because detail is a noun. Well, let's see what would happen here. It would be something like add detail for the set property thing. Blah. Okay, well, what are the analogs here? This would be details is the analog of properties, yes?
Properties or property value? Details,
No.
I think, will be.
That's the analog of properties. I think. What does property value do again?
So property and detail, properties and details.
What do you
So
mean?
that, you know, it's singular or plural.
Okay, well, let's write down what each of these things is. Okay, so here we've got. Let's write it down in terms of annotation, which we understand. Okay, so let's first of all write down cases, right? Which are, okay, so we've got annotated of thing, comma, annotation, right?
Value.
That's
right.
Well, thing, comma, annotation. That's in place annotated object, right? Okay, next case. We've got annotations of a thing.
Object.
What does, well, you want to call it of the whole object.
Oh, it's the option, isn't it?
What are you talking about?
It's the option. Yeah, it's an option.
So I'm sorry, I wrote down what currently we have implemented. Annotations is what you called annotation rules. It is meant to be
And
the
let's
option.
call it that.
Sorry about that.
Call it that, so we're not confused.
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Okay. Okay, now what? Now we have the next thing, which is annotate, which is an object with, this really should be called an element here. Annotate an object with an annotation, right?
Yes.
Uh,
I mean, that's what then we'll go to the annotation rules option.
Yeah, set an annotation from
don't you
the
need
outside.
where what? Don't you need where where?
Oh, yeah. Where arrow annotation, basically. Set an annotation from the outside. Right? And that's, and just to write down what the analogs of these are. So this is the equivalent of, annotated is the equivalent of property. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, annotation rules, what's that the equivalent of?
Properties.
Properties.
Which is an option?
Yes.
Weird. Okay. Annotate is the equivalent of set property. Right.
Yes.
Okay. Then we've also got a few of these other ones like annotation delete. Now we've got annotation value. Annotation value of an object and where, right? Which returns an annotation.
Correct. And if you don't specify the where, it returns all annotations.
No, that should be
okay.
Object where what?
What's that?
It's object where, actually it should be the where and then comma the what.
So we are talking about two different things. One is the setting and one is the retrieving.
No, there's no setting there. And then you've got the set property. This is the setting of property value. This is set property, and this then has the additional form of property value blah 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 equals, right? Correct?
Yes. No, but property value evaluate. It returns you the what. It gives you the actual value of the what.
Yes, that's right. That's what we're saying here. What are you complaining about here? This is saying the object and where, and it
gives you the what.
Yeah. Make sense, Charles?
Right.
Okay. All right. What is property list? That is, what does that do? That gives you all annotations, right?
Yes.
Annotations in an object, otherwise known as property list. Okay. All right. So these are our cases. So the issue is, for many things like in audio, images, etc., the word annotation is just fine, and these parts of speech work fine, and so on. Okay. So the issue is, what are some cases where we think it works least well? Okay. An annotation in a graph, I think the color of a vertex arguably could be an annotation. But
color in not the actual sense of color, but just as a mark.
Well, I mean, something like the weight of a vertex does not seem like a very good annotation. Okay, so let's list bad cases. Okay, bad examples. Okay, so weight of an edge doesn't seem like an annotation. It seems more fundamental to the graph. Am I making sense? Yes, no, Charles?
Yes.
Right. Okay, what's another example of a bad example? Or is this the only bad example?
Well,
I mean, for graph, you have capacity, weight, coordinate, right? I mean, beside, I think, the label, style, right? Actually, the one which are coming from the wrapper, which are the roughly the one.
Sorry, I got distracted by something. Could you repeat that, Charles? Sorry.
I say for graph, you have weight, capacity, for example, or coordinate, which are really.
Okay, weight, capacity.
And coordinate, for example.
Okay, so how are those represented in a graph ultimately? Like the weights, for instance. You give them as annotations, but then how are they actually inserted in the graph? I mean, why isn't it, you know, something like, why don't we have, just like we have weighted data, why don't we have weighted edge or even weighted data itself?
I mean, because for the graph, it's kind of a global thing. You manipulate the graph at once, so you don't really want to weight individually, right?
No, I understand that. But Charles, what I'm saying is, I don't think it's right. You know, we've got plenty of other things in this list that do not genericize themselves. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yes.
So we could imagine for these cases having something which I actually think would be an improvement anyway, which is some explicit way of specifying weighting.
One could imagine that. I agree.
We
don't have it. I mean, you have it in the sense of generically with properties, you can still do it.
Yeah, obviously.
But we could make it simpler.
Yeah, right. But I'm saying that could be the form, just like some of these other things, you know, store themselves that way. This could be the canonical form, or even I don't care which one is the canonical form. That's up to you, right? But I also think that, yeah, okay. So let me just understand what some of these other things. Would this be the right construct, weighted edge? Or is it the case that really we want to consider a wrapper just called weighted?
Well, that's very generic all of a sudden.
Well, I know it is, but I mean, like weighted data is.
I mean, the advantage is that you don't want weighted edge. I mean, or we'll have weighted edge, weighted vertex, right? And for mesh, we'll have weighted cell, weighted something.
Yeah, I mean, whereas weighted could conceivably. So right now, weighted data. How does this correspond to what we're talking about here, the concept that we're talking about here?
This is in a way kind of a list with annotations in a way. You could kind of almost see it like that.
Yes.
You know, because it then has weights for all the data.
Right.
So
what happens?
There are different interpretations of what weights mean, what weight means in different contexts.
Right. But if it's just thought of as an annotation, I mean, does this work?
No.
Should it?
I don't think so. At
You
least
think
not
that's
typically.
meaningless? Because you don't know what the weighting of the things that don't have.
Right. Yeah, the weights are useful as a relative thing.
Right. So you're saying everybody has to be weighted, or it doesn't make sense.
Correct.
That's all the cases I know too. I don't know of anything where.
I mean, you could probably come up with some case where.
Yeah, well, there's a default. I mean, it's like in a round where there's something where much of the data has plus minus, but some of it doesn't. Maybe. No, okay. Forget that comment.
I was going to say in the Viz meeting, we have some weights where it isn't, required to be universal, but.
For what?
For labels.
Okay, listen. What my tentative conclusion is that annotation is the right name, and that we should deal with these cases where it doesn't fit separately.
I have the impression that anything which is mathematical or that it affects the behavior of the object itself doesn't play very nicely with annotated.
I know, but what's an example of that? That's not the things we're primarily talking about here. I mean, we're talking about the rendering color of a vertex and things, which is not of that type.
Right.
The case where it makes a difference is this weighting stuff, which has been shoehorned in, I think.
Well, I'm trying to generalize to other cases, and I think it's the mathematical nature of things that doesn't play nicely with.
Right, but so are there other cases where we want a sort of mathematical notion of annotation? Or is annotation more like styling?
I think that there's the spectrum of things being close. I think that also what we've noticed that seem to be a progression in various domains and fields. So things starting out to be slightly far afield, and then it might sort of move closer and becomes a more tightly integrated object over time.
Example?
So I'm thinking of, so if you do you know what point patterns are from statistical mechanics? Location of gas molecules, let's say.
What do you mean by? I've heard of what? No, I thought they. What are you talking about?
Point patterns or point collections. So you're studying the distribution of these, point patterns.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, and they can be location of trees, location of stars, location of gas.
That's what spatial statistics is where I've heard of that.
Yes. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Now, clearly, like say that it's location of trees. There are other attributes that are important to know depending on what you want to do. So for instance, for tree, I've learned that diameter at breast height is a really important thing. Species is a really important thing. And then there's a progression of more. Now,
dead or alive. Yes.
Well, that might be good for you, if you're doing resource inventory.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, so you can view that as just sort of extra data, but for some things it's kind of key, clearly. And then there's a notion of marked point processes where you kind of model these extra values in addition. So they have distributions on their own. I'm saying, so then you have to model them in a coupled way. So they go from being kind of a little far afield to moving closer to the object, and you have a more comprehensive model that takes that into account.
I understand. So what you're saying is, I mean, to paraphrase that, what you're saying is, at the beginning, you're just saying, what's the distribution of trees? Later, you want to say, but I care whether they're oak trees or not. Right.
But I kind of think that we'll see that kind of progression with other objects in the system, So maybe
actually, Roger, one way to characterize that is the following: things like, is it an oak tree or not? The question is, what is computable? Like the position, there's a good kind of calculus of positions, and there's a good theory of sort of spatial distribution and so on. There may not be such a meaningful theory. Like for example, let's say in an extreme case, let's say we've got a characterization of the shape of the tree, which right now there isn't a good way to characterize. There are some weird allometry parameters and so on. But imagine that you could characterize the shape of the tree.
Right.
You wanted to add that. Go ahead.
Exactly. So in that particular case, I happen to have read something about forestry.
Yeah.
Things you do here. But anyways, there is quite a few. It's actually not that many, and people actually do it to do forest inventory or resource inventories at large scale. So it's kind of a well-known, well-established thing.
What is
the additional parameters that you kind of measure on?
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Yes.
But I kind of think that that's a progression that you get. So there's a question, So we designed a graph and network subsystem. So anything that's just pure connectivity is graph. Anything beyond that is sort of network. We designed it to be a multi-objective system, because I know on the order of 150 or so diagrammatic languages, graph-like languages, like Molecule, for instance, or but then, can you in fact build and prototype and use that in the system? And when do you decide that it's a new object? When do you decide?
Well, right, but what we've done with Molecule, just like with NetGraph, is that inside they're graphs, but they have additional decoration.
Right. Right. And that's kind of how it was designed for. That's what we designed to be able to do, that kind of thing. You can first start out having them inside.
So your point is, are we using generic decorators or are we using specific decorators? Like for molecules, have specific decorators.
Right. And for System Modeler, what a node is something it's another system. The connectivity semantics, the edge semantics is very complicated for what it takes to connect system models. So there,
are we using graph to represent that? We are at some level.
No, we're not the graph that we have, but yes, we are using graphs internally in system modelers.
Okay, so your point is that we want something that is a bland way to connect things to elements of our structures, like graphs, for example.
Yes.
And that then, so that should be as meaningless as possible a term, which is what we've concluded, right? That should be a meaningless term. And if you want it to actually mean something, like, for example, in the weighting case, for instance, one might need to promote that to, a notion of ultimately we could even imagine a weighted graph, although I don't think we want to do it that way.
We have a weighted graph, but we decided to, it's part of graph, okay? If it has weights, it's a weighted graph.
Fine. I mean, although we decided planar graph would be its own separate top-level head wrapper because of it.
Who decided that?
It's a constructor. You generate.
It's just a constructor. It's not an object.
Fair enough. Okay, fine. Okay, but so what we're looking for. So first of all, let me just confirm. This design we are basically happy with. Is that true? We're still looking for a name, but we're basically happy with the design. Is that a true statement from everybody?
I have to say, I think we can live with annotation.
Well, let's give it another push for a minute, but let's just check that we're happy with the design. I haven't really paid attention to all this tags and so on stuff. Has that been thought through now?
So that seems to what we had discussed for audio. It seems to be the same for graph as well.
No, we should probably discuss that later on. I mean, we don't have that. Essentially, this is a whole query system you add, which
no, the tags, not the query system. Right, so no, the query system has not been discussed. But the fact that we use tags goes to where goes to what.
Right.
That is a common
But
trait.
that tag is what we call the custom property, right? It's
Correct.
it's a user-created property. Or
Exactly.
As opposed to a system one, which is just done with an option name in the case of graph.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. By the way,
we call them. We did the way we said that they're standard versus, custom.
Yep, custom.
well, that's fine, but one of them is a string tag and the other is a symbol name, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. Seems okay to me. Now, with respect to this annotation propagation stuff, which you've not yet addressed in graph, right? We are addressing that here.
It is kind of addressed in the graph, actually. I think Charles will speak to it, but I think the situation is well addressed there.
Well, it's coming from 12, right? So we probably discuss it during our review.
Okay, but so that's the subgraph stuff, the propagation of annotations to subgraphs and things. Is that right?
Among other things, yes.
Yes, and it's the same idea we, in audio here, I guess.
Right. Okay. All right. We are, of course, running out. Let's one more try here. And I'm not happy with this name. I think it's a long word. It's rather. I mean, I agree with Roger. It's not terrible, but I think we might be able to do better. All right. Let's try other kinds of things. Adjunct. Blah.
So I would say of all those ones, annotations is the least obscure.
Yes.
So it has that advantage going.
I agree. Right. Lack of obscurity is important. On a live stream, someone suggested layer, which won't make it, but that is indeed a related concept. Well, fair enough. Why don't we go ahead and start implementing, and why don't you work through with Charles what will be needed to update graph to be able to use annotation. Now, we've still got this strange thing called annotation that's out there that means something completely different, which I think we should deprecate. Right? We're not walking on top of that syntax, and we won't. But I think that particular thing, what were we going to call that? The current thing that's called annotation.
So I'm all for that. We work through. We know what the implementation is, but I don't think we need to make it a requirement for 12 to change graph and mesh. We don't want to.
I agree. I agree. I don't think that's a problem.
Okay.
That would be a 12.1 type.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
I mean, I will discuss though with Charles to make sure that if we do that for audio, what we have there will not block anything, essentially.
No, I understand. We need to make sure we have the design there, but we don't need to implement.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so what happens to... Did we already discuss this, Parth? Do you remember?
Which one? What happens to annotation, Stephen?
What?
You're talking about what happens to annotation.
Yes, I think we had another name for that concept. Well, actually, we already have mouse annotation and things here, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't fully engaged. I
think it's a very obscure name for what this is anyway.
Well, I mean,
so
it was imagined something that's general.
And it's much more general than those four.
Well, what else does it do?
And by the way, mouse annotation is something that works with annotation.
Yeah, but what does it do? What does annotation do?
Nothing.
Okay, and that's its purpose.
That's pretty general.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like the visualization code internally will occasionally wrap annotation around things when we want to carry things through from, the symbolic side to the primitives.
Yeah, its purpose is entirely to be an inert wrapper, which can be acted upon by other constructs.
Right, which is the same thing as annotated, basically, here. Yeah, I mean, the issue is that there are some things that are actually active here, like the mouse one and so on. Oh, I see. No, not really. I mean, it's just, I see that the mouse annotation just has this inside it.
And then when something else sees that, it does something.
So in fact, annotation in its use here is consistent with what we're talking about.
Yeah. By the way, mouse annotation doesn't even wrap annotation. I mean, if you look at the first example for mouse annotation.
Okay.
See, the annotation is in the first output, but the mouse annotation is in the second output. If you mouse over.
Yes, I understand. Yeah. Right. But so what is the deal with the use of this in rasterize, which seems like very much the same type of thing that we're trying to do with annotated?
Right, and so rasterize, if it sees a specifically constructed annotation with with this region string, then it generates some additional information about where that is pixel wise.
How does it generate that?
You have to ask for it from rasterize.
How?
Rasterize that region string as the second argument.
Region specified by annotation construct. I didn't even know that worked. That's actually really useful. I could have used that a bunch of times. I didn't know we had that. Okay. Humph.
Yeah, there's an example in the rasterize scope examples that does this.
Okay, but in any case, this use of annotation is really very consistent with the use of annotated here. And maybe we should just use annotation for this, rather than annotated, which we invented in order to avoid annotation, which I don't think we need to avoid.
I tend to agree.
I guess one of the things we discussed before is that annotated element, okay, for element it makes sense, but previously you had expression annotation, which then got translated into annotation rules. As long as annotation doesn't get a whole object and then put annotations under annotation rules, I guess that's consistent.
Right, but annotate is the thing that gets the whole object.
Right.
Annotation is merely showing the annotation that is there. So actually, I think annotation is better than annotated. So, okay, so then annotation will get spruced up to become the new annotation. Annotation rules is an option for a bigger, object. Annotate is the thing that comes from the outside and gives an annotation to a thing from the outside. Annotations, what does annotations do? Annotations gives the same thing as annotation rules. It gives the right-hand side of annotation rules, doesn't it?
I think you need all the different, what you guys call tags and values. I mean, I assume it gives it the whole thing.
Yes, but annotation rules also has the whole thing. Annotation rules can be for a whole object.
Property list returns the list of tags, if I'm not mistaken, rather than the full annotation.
Right.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, I see. So I see. Gives list of tags in the LHSs of the RHS of annotation rules. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes.
I wonder if it should be called annotation names or something. It does encourage me that the thing that we currently call annotation, we can use, does exactly the same thing. I find that encouraging. All right, we'll do one more push. We should all have a think about whether there's an alternative name, but otherwise I think annotation is going to be the winner.
I'm happy with that.
And then we try and figure out how weighted becomes something slightly different. And we are going to have to think about annotation propagation and so on. It seems fine. Okay, I think that's it for this meeting. I think we are going next to the visualization meeting, and people who are on our live stream are going to change live streams, and see you there. Okay, so I think let's go ahead. Next step for this is implementation of these things, and then we'll come back for an additional. Hopefully that will be fairly fast, and then let's come back for a final review of this stuff.
Most of that already exists for audio, just needs to be renamed.
Okay, terrific.
Do we want to keep the annotation style? That's yet another object that Carlo has implemented for things like audio plot that would need to plot the annotation.
Yes, I think that's nice.
All right.
Is it annotation style or annotation styles?
I think style, following plot style.
Yep.
I see. So if there was just one annotation, it would be, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure about the S there. Because
Okay.
I think that if it's going to refer to the tag, I think it should be called styles, because plot style doesn't by default refer to the tag.
Okay.
That's a good point. We'll play with it.
Okay. All right. Very nice. And you guys should think about the image case a bit. See whether this stuff is going to work for that. All right. This will make me so much happier with respect to graphs when we get this nice uniform thing there.
So it's merely the name really that bothers you. The design is...
No, the design is not bothering me.
Right.
There's not a problem with the design. It's just...
No, I realize it's the name, okay? And I'm fine with...
Right. And you're even this annotation value equals. I'm even okay with that.
Oh,
very good.
We're making progress.
Oh,
Yeah,
I am
we're
excited
making
about that for audio as well.
Every developer and every advanced user will be excited about that.
All right. Okay. Well, fine. We win some, we lose some. But yeah, right. Okay. Look, if we can change this blasted property name,
good.
Yeah. I mean, but we should still keep thinking a little bit about this word annotation to see if there's something better. Although I'm not horrified by this. All right. See some of you on the next meeting, and I'll be there in just a moment.
Okay. See you.
Thanks.